matters of discretion. And I noted your questions to some of the earlier witnesses. So each policy, well, in addition, each policy often has a number of clauses. And with this, many matters of discretion, I question whether discretion is in effect being restricted at all. And moving on down to my last section is around definitions. So I support the recommendation of Ms. Lawrenson to reject the inclusion of a new defined term for ancillary rural earthworks, as I consider this unnecessarily increases the complexity of the earthworks terminology. I would like to draw the panel's attention that the inclusion of cultivation as a new defined term will necessitate consequential amendments for earthworks type activities within the National Grid yard. Something doesn't need to be landed right now, but it's just something to keep in mind, particularly as we move into the network utilities provisions. And that is it. I'm open to any questions.
I'm going to get Commissioner Littlejohn to start, Carolyn, because I'm just looking back on another couple of aspects to cover that last point you've made. So are you ready to go, Kit?
Yeah. Thanks, Caroline. The suggestion you've made about locating earthworks up into the network utilities chapter, I mean, I understand the basis for it. What if you go into the network utilities chapter, just as part of the rules, there's a note 3 which says all network utilities are also subject to the applicable provisions in the following chapters: subdivision earthworks, light, noise, signs, and the overlay chapters. Now, presumably, if we accept your logic and say that the earthworks provisions ought to come up into this chapter, then presumably don't we have to migrate out of all of those other district-wide chapters the other relevant rules around subdivision, light, noise, signs, etc.?
I would imagine so, but I haven't looked at whether the National Planning Standards provide any guidance on that. But certainly that one that I looked at it's not hugely clear, but the way I interpreted it is that the network utilities chapter takes precedence in terms of location.
Well, I mean, I hadn't picked it up the first time I read it, but I see the subtlety in the point you're making now, because Reg 30 says the earthworks chapter must include cross-references to any relevant earthworks provisions under the energy, infrastructure and transport heading, which suggests, well, it implies that those provisions are already in that chapter, and you've just got to make sure that you cross-reference it in the earthworks. So it would be quite, I'll go back and have a look to see whether the other resource things such as lights, noise and sign, there's also a similar sort of provision, because that might give a clue. Because if there's one thing that lawyers like is for a document to be internally consistent and logical, and if you've come up with a good reason for earthworks to go up into the NU chapter, then we need to make sure we don't create an internal inconsistency. But I take the point there. The other one I wanted to, standards, I'm happy with that. Matters of I wanted to talk to you, if I can, about the complaint. Well, the complaint's probably a little bit pejorative, but this is in earthworks rule R8, and I guess in some of the other rules as well, the use of this, the matter of discretion number 2, and it's the one concerning sites. Earthworks will compromise archaeological sites and areas of significance to Māori. And last week we had quite a lot of discussion around the relationship between what has unfortunately been acronymized the SASM chapter and the earthworks chapter. And it appears the intent is that even though the objectives and policies in the SASM chapter are drafted quite broadly, the rules are very much focused on those sites that have been specifically schedulized in the plan. And then the earthworks rules, that, as we've understood them, were therefore to attend to managing effects on sites that hadn't been scheduled or no one knew about and potentially were damaged as a consequence of earthworks. And so to that extent, RD matter 2 relating to sites and areas of significance to Māori would still cover the situations of earthworks potentially having an impact on sites that weren't scheduled, and would as a consequence trigger the ADP standard to come in, the accidental discovery policy. I mean, look, that's our sort of current thinking. So I'd just be interested to get a sense of whether you had sort of looked at it that way, and if so, or if not, where the notion of taking out from the earthworks for network utilities, this notion doesn't leave some sort of hole in the coverage for this issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it almost comes back to a principle of, do you assume that all of the Māori sites and areas of significance have been identified in the plan? And I think taking that approach certainly provides everybody with certainty. And as a practitioner, that would be my preference. Understanding, of course, that, and this comes back to almost a chicken and egg problem with the accidental discovery protocol, because you don't know that something's there until you've found it, and then you know that you need to take action around that, and protection as the case may be. But I'm just concerned that, to my mind, if you've identified your Māori areas and sites of significance, then, and it's a little bit like historic heritage, it's the same kind of issue, how far is the area of influence around that? And I think by the approach that this particular plan has taken, that is a big area of unknown. So if it sticks with the approach that it is now, even though you may have identified and scheduled and it's on the maps that this is a Maori area of site of significance as an example, or even archaeological site, how far do you take that area of influence beyond that?
Well, the SASM rule R4 says you take it to 50 metres. And so following your point then, this rule would only have relevance if you were going to compromise a site that you were further than 50 metres away from. I guess that's a question in and of itself.
Yes.
What do we mean by compromise?
Indeed. And I think that does open up to interpretation issues going forward.
Yeah.
Me as a practitioner would much prefer certainty. I'm either in or I'm out, I'm within 50 metres. I know where I stand. If I'm 250, 500 metres away from it, whether it does it or does it not. So to me, the approach that they've taken is uncertain.
Okay, yep, that's understood. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Carolyn. It's good.
Right, thank you very much. I just had a couple of questions about the NES for electricity transmission activities. You note in your paragraph 9 that this only relates to lines and structures that were existing as at 14th January 2010. That's right, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
Yes. Why was that? Do you know why that?
I have no idea, but it is interesting. It was the NES-ETA has obviously been drafted around the existing ones and not applied to any future ones. It's a shame Rebecca's not here because she may have some insights. I'm really not sure on the reasons. Okay.
So if you have a new line that you're seeking, you've got to fit in with the plan, or you might designate.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And generally, the provisions in the NES overrides the district plan earthworks rules?
They do completely,
yes. Yeah. Okay. So I presume there's not too many new lines in New Plymouth district?
again, I couldn't answer that, and I think it's there's two things. There's the ones that obviously have been, and again, shame Rebecca's not here, the ones that have been put in between 2010 and now, but also going forward, you know, if there's any changes or any even decommissioning,
Yes.
which is likely.
Okay, all right. So for decommissioning, the standard would apply, not the district plan.
Again, it depends whether depends on the time frame that that infrastructure was put in.
Okay, but if it was pre-2010,
Yes,
the standard would apply
correct. Yes.
over the district plan.
Yes.
Okay. And look, I did go through the exercise of comparing the standard with EWP3 and EWP5. You would have heard the discussion about those two policies I had previously. And they seem to cover generally the same sorts of aspects that those district plan policies. So I saw an element of consistency in relation to the coverage. Is that fair?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Right, I'll skip over that. Commissioner Littlejohn's talked about how far do we go with the moving the plan provisions around. So that's all okay.
Just to follow up on that, Stephen, I having got the national planning standard out, I can say that there are similar statements as Ms. Ratz identified at 30 in respect of subdivision and noise, but not lighting or signs. So I guess that's just something for us to take a note of.
Okay. Thank you. I do want to have a bit of a chat about this term, including earthworks for ancillary activities. So you've got a definition of network utilities in the PDP, which you've written for us in paragraph 15, needs a project, work, system or structure that is a network utility operation. So it's really a question thinking back to the definition of what network utility operations are under 166 of the Act, which is a whole list of activities. I would have thought that that definition covers just about anything that you might be doing around a network utility. And do you really need this ancillary activities term? So that's my question.
I think where I came unstuck is when you read it, it says means a project, work, system or structure that is a network utility operation. And so for me, that's why I thought that, you know, putting a hard stand area, for instance, you know, next to, I'm just making examples up here, obviously, but putting a hard stand area for parking for access, it's not actually to do with the, well, I guess you could argue it's to do with the network utility operation. But something like a retaining wall might not be. And I think I was really just trying to avoid, and maybe it creates more, I'm not sure, arguments going forward as to whether something is a project, work, system or structure that's a network utility operation or not. That was really where I was coming from.
So did you go back and have a look at 166 and?
Yeah, they're very much focused on the, let me bring that up.
So you'd be particularly interested in 166C, I think.
Yeah, as an electricity operator or electricity distributor, the purpose of line function, mind you. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not so worried about that because that, you know, defines network utility operator, and I'm comfortable with that. But it was more the works. How far do you take that definition of, you know, the term works and the district plan definition?
But what about I? Have you had a look at that?
So undertakes or propose to undertake a project or work, same language, prescribed as a network utility operation for the purposes of this definition.
Mm.
I think I don't
Yeah.
think any of them particularly clear. They seem to all use the same language, which doesn't provide any clarity.
No, and maybe
guess
we're
that was
splitting
my point.
hairs. Yeah, maybe splitting hairs, because certainly when I'm applying for these sorts of activities
Mm.
for clients, always add the term and ancillary activities on the back of
Yeah,
applications, and
to
then
give you
try
that flexibility. Yeah,
then you can
exactly.
define, then you can list out what they are. So
Yep.
yeah, it's probably not a big issue in the scheme of things, but I was just interested in your thoughts there. Right, I'm now looking at your paragraph 18, around EWR 9. Yeah, I just couldn't work out the last sentence of 18. I do not support the inclusion of matters of discretion which apply to earthworks outside a scheduled site. So this is what you were talking about before.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
How far is that area of influence? Yep.
As the application of such a matter of discretion is insufficiently uncertain.
Yeah.
That double negative. So what are you trying to say there?
It's the same thing. So if you said that like a scheduled site is this big and it's been identified on the district plan as being this is the spatial extent, how far is the area of influence on those? And I think by having this particular matter of discretion, I think it opens the plan up for uncertainty, and I like certainty when I'm looking at in using plans.
Okay.
So to my mind, if you're doing earthworks, inside that, absolutely no argument at all. But if you're outside, how far outside before it becomes a non-issue?
So are you familiar with plans that have mapped buffer areas around scheduled sites?
Well, interestingly, that's where Waikato District Plan started with its draft. And in the end, before we notified, we, again, being the Waikato District Council, took that out because of the uncertainty, because we figured that if we've identified the site as being this big, for instance, then why are we putting an extra buffer on it? And we'd undertaken, we had experts undertaking really detailed conversations with iwi, and we were certain at that point that we had really good information to say this is the spatial extent. So we actually went the reverse. We took that buffer out, but I know that this plan actually brings it in as 50 metres.
So you just stuck with the site that there was physical evidence around, or was there any other?
A bit of both. So it was Dr. Des Kahotia undertook that for us and undertook both a spatial, like a physical examination of the site, as well as korero with the relevant iwi. Because sometimes, absolutely, it is wider than what's spatially, what you can physically see, but the district plan reflected that.
So I know Des pretty well. So he looked at both the physical evidence and any other evidence he could find?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So he did over the whole of Waikato District, did he? Wow, it's a pretty massive job. Yeah.
And that when the district council was writing the plan and in consultation with Tainui, the area, the kind of the areas where the marae was prioritised, and fortification and things like that, where there was a key linkage to some history there.
Okay. Right. I think that's probably about all I had. I did have a note about 19. I better read what I was. So this was your. No, I think that's already been covered. So look, that's everything I have. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you again for your attendance and your assistance.
No problem.
And, as I said to a few other people, I'm sure we'll see you again.
Indeed, look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. right, I think that's the end of our people we're hearing under hearing 4. Is that right, Julie?
That's correct.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, I think we should then move on to just next steps, I suppose, from a procedural perspective. And this is where I'd like to have a discussion, particularly with Sarah Edwards, just about next steps with the right of reply and some other procedural matters. And perhaps Hamish was around about where we did have some other discussions, I think, when you weren't here, Sarah. So perhaps if Hamish was available too, that would be useful.
Yep. Afternoon, Stephen. I'm here.
Yeah. Hello. So Sarah, you've kept tabs with quite a lot of the hearing, but you haven't been here all the time. Is that right?
No, that's
No.
right.
Yeah. Okay. And there was, I listed down 6 matters which we thought we should cover off from a procedural perspective. You weren't here when we started today, and I've suggested that we don't do the officer right of replies today, just because it's been quite a full day of hearings. There's quite a lot of new information, and I think it would be good to have a bit of a breather, particularly on the right of replies. So I have suggested that we do that perhaps on Wednesday afternoon, and I'm just seeking some feedback from you and also from Julie and the others whether that's going to be suitable.
Yes, absolutely. There has been quite a bit of evidence presented today on earthworks in particular, which we had already anticipated that Nicola Lawrenson would need some extra time to talk to this. So we had scheduled her to speak last, but certainly hearing the evidence today, I think we'd be most grateful if we could have that additional time, and Wednesday would certainly suit that.
Yes, and as you know, I'm very mindful of people's well-being at this tricky time with people juggling work commitments and families, and just it's really tough. So I think given that we're scheduled through to Thursday, if we needed the time, that would be sensible. So I think for all of the right of replies, we're happy to sort of hear those as a block on Wednesday afternoon. The next thing was also on Wednesday afternoon having a discussion with you and maybe some of the other planners on your team about the matters that Kit's raised at the start of hearing 4, and we do want to set up a process where we can have a good roundtable discussion, I suppose, in a collegial way about there's reasons why you've set the plan out the way you have, and then we've got some questions. So not anything particularly formal, but just a good practitioners chat around the various issues from a legal and planning perspective. So we were hoping to do that with Commissioner McMahon and Commissioner Coffin joining us as well, because it has issues across the whole plan. So I was just thinking about whether you've had any thoughts about, or we have any thoughts about that and how we might set that up, and whether you needed any further guidance on our questions.
No, we understand what the questions are, and we've already had a discussion with Council about that to look at going back to how we crafted and how we set up the framework, which started a number of years before the plan was notified, and some of the approaches that we took and the decision making around that, and then how that would then translate into those matters of discretion. So we have had our initial discussion about that. What we would need to do is we would need more time to look at the matter.
more closely.
Mm,
But it's also the things that have popped for me is the scope to be able to change any of this. This is what we really need to understand. I've gone back and looked at Helen Johnson's initial submission on plan structure and that sort of side of it. I'm not 100% convinced that's where we have actually got scope
no,
to make
yeah.
any changes. So I would like to probably talk with you about where that scope is. We've also had a check of a few other submissions in there as well. So that's the first matter, is scope,
So,
and then how we go about making any changes if that's where we decide land where we think there is the ability to make those changes. But certainly we would be very open to discussing how to navigate this in a very open and transparent manner so that everybody understands what's actually happening. That would be marvellous. So certainly would be very willing to hear how, if you've got any guidance on how that can happen as well.
okay.
Sarah, will Ms. Wallace be available on Wednesday afternoon to join that discussion?
She hasn't caught up with today's events, but I'm sure she will make herself available. So I haven't touched base with her today.
Okay, and we're having a the other two commissioners have, because they went on this hearing, have been pretty busy rushing around on other things. So the four of us haven't had a decent discussion either, and we have scheduled some time tomorrow to just do that. But I think, as I say, if we do it on a round table basis of let's just discuss and debate and understand, and just in that type of forum, I think that'll be really valuable. And as I say, you might suggest there's a few from the council side that can contribute to that general discussion. We're open to how you'd like to set it up from your side, but I'll certainly arrange for if they're available, and I need to talk to them, and we'll work back through Julie about the actual timing where we could do this. So
okay,
that's good.
So
Okay.
it's your initial thinking that would do the writer replies first, and then perhaps move on to the second part?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we'd certainly like to talk to Mr. Lloyd as well as part of the writer replies, because we've been hearing a lot about noise issues, and there's a few disagreements there on an expert basis. So just his feeling. And we also think, obviously, the setting up both the writer reply discussion and this broader one, we can follow up with some further documentation in the written writer reply for the writer replies, and also if there's any further work to do thinking about the other issue that Kit's raised, we can set up a process to do that as well. So we thought we'd better have a discussion sooner rather than later. We could leave it to the end, but that would be pretty tough, I think. All right. There was two other things on my list. One was,
Stephen, just before you move on, can I just ask Sarah, the materials that we get off the website are all PDF, but I see a number of the witnesses, because they're manipulating Appendix 1, must be doing that in a Word version. Are those easily available for the commissioners? It's just, I hate just lobbing a grenade and then seeing what happens. I might want to satisfy myself in terms of some of this drafting by actually doing some worked examples for myself to see whether I'm just being pedantic. So is there any way I could potentially get Appendix 1's, well, the appendices 1 to the hearing 4 topics in a Word version that's got the actual chapters that I could then potentially just even if it's just to amuse myself about these sorts of issues, so I'm a bit more informed for Wednesday's discussion?
No problem. They were drafted initially in Word, so the PDFs come off those, so we have those original Word copies available. Just
if you flick them to Julie, and then Julie can provide them around, that'd be helpful.
Certainly.
Thank you. Sarah, I'm not sure whether you were there when we had the discussion with the airport people about the contours, and this is where Hamish was certainly listening in pretty intently. I did suggest that given both the origin of sort of the issues and the importance of that facility, whether there might be value in the council team getting together with the airport team and just working through those issues in some sort of conferencing way. And Hamish, I think you expressed you thought that was a good idea.
Yes, that's right. And we have been liaising with airport representatives since last week, setting that up.
Okay. And are there any other submitters going to sit in on that? Have you checked that through?
I haven't heard. The other one I recall was Sarah Mako from
Yes.
Te Atiawa, so I'll follow up with Sarah to see if she's still interested.
Yeah. So look, my thoughts on that were, I mentioned that it would be good to do that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but I'm also very mindful that just to keep things tidy, that might best be reported in the right of reply around for noise. So all I'm really saying is that if you needed some extra time for that right of reply, just to accommodate those discussions and report back formally in the right of reply, that would be okay with me, but just sing out and let me know if that would work.
Thank you. Yep. No, the intention is certainly to come back in the right of reply with a joint witness statement.
Okay.
And if we need more time, we'll certainly let you know.
All right. And the second thing on that was, are there any other airport, if you are getting together, I'm talking about the SPZ airport zone and other issues around the airport, whether if you are getting together, it might be useful to extend any witness discussion about matters that are coming up in the future. That was my other thought on that.
Okay. I hadn't turned our mind to that, and there's a separate reporting officer for the airport zone generally. But what I'll do, I'll liaise with that member of the council team, and we'll look into that.
Okay. Well, it's as far as I see, this is something we've asked for Sarah Ongley and yourselves to organise and just make the most of the opportunity, I suppose. The other matter was that we did in the light chapter, we did make some queries about sort of further technical advice, and I presume that's just being looked at as part of the right of reply, Sarah, with the reporting team on light.
Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll hear back on that. Now, 2 final matters I have, one related and one unrelated to hearing 4. The Blue Haven next steps process, as I think I've indicated, it has fallen between the gaps a little bit in relation to timing, and there was a flurry of correspondence in early August about this, but then Mr. Brophy, I think, suggested that perhaps the conferencing or dialogue could go as far as actually formulating an actual zone, and then we could actually look at both of those provisions. But I didn't want to require that of the council if you didn't see that as part of the matters that you were comfortable with in that process. So whether you've thought about that further, Sarah, or with the team?
Yes, we have discussed this. So yeah, we are absolutely supportive of holding a pre-hearing meeting, and feel that it would really be helpful to help define and narrow those issues between the 2 parties. And what we actually propose is that we do it in a 2-step process. So the first being that we would agree an agenda, and that could be assisted by legal counsel, both sides to help us navigate through that. And what we could consider in the pre-agreed agenda, that would also help us isolate those issues before meeting. Potential agenda items could be perhaps the role and function of the sub-regional centre, possible permitted activities, how that fits with the centre's hierarchy that we've got proposed as notified, and whether there is scope for an alternative zone. So everything we can have in a free and frank discussion through when we actually meet in person. But setting an agenda in the first instance would be the first step we'd like to do. If you were interested, we could, once the agenda was agreed, we could actually provide that to the panel, so you understand what is to be discussed, and would be most welcome to do this. When we had the meeting, we would engage an independent facilitator to help both parties navigate the agenda items and help identify those issues that the parties had agreed on, or whether we've still got matters that are outstanding. And what we would see is that was attended by senior council officers as well. So we'd have both the planner working on the industrial zone as well as the planner working on the commercial and centre zone as well as some seniors, myself. And we'd also have Miss Wallace, our legal counsel, on there. From Blue Haven would say much the same sort of thing, the planner and the submitter and their lawyer as well. What we don't think is necessary, but of course we are open to talk about this, and Blue Haven might have a totally different perspective on what I'm talking about now, is that we don't think that the economists would necessarily need to attend that pre-hearing meeting, but a separate expert caucusing might be a better course of action for those experts. However, everything we're most welcome, open to talking about that. We've also thought about whether when we actually get to discussing the matter, and we're looking to formulate some ideas into the 42A report, whether this should be held in a separate hearing for Blue Haven. But what we thought, and we actually agree with Miss Barry Pacino, who's the lawyer working for Blue Haven, that it's probably best to decide that through the any sort of pre-hearing mediation that we have decided together. And what we would be looking at there is potentially a separate one, or it could just go on to the end of the industrial zone hearing, and perhaps set a day aside from that. But I think it would probably be quite a good idea to talk about that with the parties together. Does that help?
It helps a lot, and I'm thinking aloud here that we certainly don't need to be managing this process. So I think we'll probably drop a minute, just a brief one, sort of I suppose confirming and ratifying the approach of getting together, and that two-step approach sounds really sensible to me. It certainly sounds sensible that it's not just a witness conference. It's much broader than that. It's a pre-hearing process where the parties, the council can be involved. I think it's that sort of nature that having that broad and inclusive approach is going to be much more helpful for us. So very supportive on that. So I think we are having a chat about this with David tomorrow, because I think he is down to be on the industrial zone hearings as well. So we might just issue a brief supportive memo around that approach in terms of a minute. In terms of timeframes, we are looking at industrial zone hearings, thinking, is it late October, November?
Yeah, it's quite soon.
Yes.
So we're reaching the point where, so I'm just looking at my schedule here. We're reaching the point, obviously we work backwards from those deadlines. So it's getting to the point where we're starting to need to act on the start of the drafting with the 42A report. So we'd be really interested to get that pre-hearing meeting underway as soon as possible.
Yes. And again, look, I think as part of that, if you're having productive discussions and that hearing's looming and the reporting time's looming, we're certainly open to working with the parties to perhaps set a separate hearing up if the time was starting to become an enemy to a good process. So just keep in touch on that. Yes.
Okay.
But there is two other things, sorry. I did get a message that perhaps one of the notices of requirement, which we heard, was perhaps the recommendation sooner rather than later would be helpful. Is that, it's the one that I'm not on, the Airport Drive one. Is that still the case, Sarah? That,
Yes, yeah, it is. It's tied up with we've got two designations that are affected there. So there's one from Waka Kotahi and the MPDC designation as well, and it's tied up with look, I could be slightly wrong here, but from my understanding, it's tied up to do with funding and also the scheduling to do with Waka Kotahi's work on the safety improvements to do with State Highway 3. So we would very much be appreciative if we could perhaps have a recommendation made on that decision as soon as possible.
Okay. Could you get one of the team to just drop us a request in writing about that? Just for the reasons, and
yes, no problem.
David's writing up because he's, I think Anton, were you involved in that, kid? Was that Anton that stepped in on the Airport Drive? Antoine, yeah. So we can certainly be responsive to that if we get a request, I think. And look, the last topic was really came out of today's discussion with Federated Farmers, and following on from yesterday with Wednesday last week, evidence from the Tangata Whenua witnesses about the scheduled sites and the way the SASM chapters operates. And, you know, I was thinking aloud, as I often do at the hearings, about whether some sort of structured relationship process between the Mana Whenua submitters, Federated Farmers and the council with those landowners that have those sites, whether it might be useful, because those are being heard in February, March next year. Seems to be a bit, you know, certainly I heard a reach out from Federated Farmers that they would appreciate that, but that would again require perhaps someone to, you know, take that on board from the council side. And it's an open question at the moment. Sarah, you could perhaps come back and talk to us again on Wednesday about whether that had merit. You know, obviously come to resourcing issues and questions as well, but I do know from experience with these other plans I've been involved in that it can end up at the end being, you know, quite tricky when the parties have, there's no relationship at all, and sometimes people talking past each other. So that was just a thought. You could have perhaps have a chat with the iwi team there at council.
So I just heard you this morning when you were talking with Federated Farmers, Hilary, about that. So you're thinking a pre-hearing meeting or some sort of process around that?
Yeah, pre-hearing process that perhaps brought the parties together around that topic, and more from a, as I say, as much as an understanding and relationship perspective about, you know, the different people involved. And yeah, I certainly heard spirit on both sides of the witnesses. This is all about perhaps some of the strategic objectives about Tangata Whenua having more involvement and engagement. So just as a procedural process matter, whether the council team, you know, had some thoughts about that and could perhaps set something up within the time we do have before those are heard in 2022.
I think it goes two ways, because there is a process in place to manage all the site visits to do where we've had submitters who have opposed the sites, the recognition or identification on the district plan. There's a process in place for that. So what I can do is talk to Joe Ritchie and my team about perhaps explaining that process. So I'm just thinking off the top of my head, maybe it might be that we give an overview of what the processes and how we're getting around those sites, and that is Joe is working with the individual hapu to have some sort of schedule to go around all of those submitters. So perhaps I could give an overview. I need to talk with Joe about that in more detail and give you an overview of what we're actually doing before, and that is why the SASM hearing is towards the end, to allow that time, and we could talk through that process with you.
Yes.
But what we could also give some more consideration is to how we can perhaps reach out or get some ideas together to those parties who haven't submitted. And what I was particularly interested in was Hilary's comments on non-regulatory type information, those sorts of things. So I will talk with Joe Ritchie over the next few days to see if I can give you a little bit of some feedback on where we've got to.
Yes, and remember in our procedures, pre-hearing and the Act pre-hearing processes can happen anytime, either under our suggestion or direction, or just between the parties, if that's thought to be a good thing. But it was just really an open question about whether that might be of assistance, certainly given the relationship focused statement that we had from Hilary today around those non-regulatory methods, which seem to be quite important to them. So look, that's all I have. It's quite a big list, sorry. And I know you guys are pretty busy. So is there any other questions you might have for us before we close the hearing, Sarah?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just ask Hamish. Well, he's there. Hamish, have you got anything from your side of things?
No, nothing at all. Thank you.
Okay. Well, are there any other queries or questions from anyone before we close up for the day?
Just one question, Stephen. Do we assume that that's a 1 p.m. start on Wednesday?
I think we should. I do have to talk to, because Antoine and David won't need to be involved in the right of reply. So yeah, I think assume 1 p.m. and we might need to go through to maybe 5. I can see it perhaps needing to include both of the topics, some reasonable time. So 1 to 5 tentatively.
Okay.
All right. So any final questions or queries from the team listening in? Happy to take those now on any of the matters we've just discussed on procedure. Looks like not. So I'd like to just say a really big thank you for everyone. We've got through hearing 4 pretty well, I think, in the circumstances, and it's been a really helpful hearing for Kit and I, and we're sure we're going to see quite a few of you again through the process. So thank you very much, and with that I'll close hearing 4. Thank you.